Welcome to Farm Here Daily, a field forward podcast. I'm David Geiger, your host. Today on Farm Here Daily, weather in Iowa. July was very wet in the state, and we're going to get the details from State Climatologist Glisan. That'll be here in just a moment. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast, as well as check out our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining me on Farm Here Daily, I have our state climatologist with us, Dr. Justin Glisan. Justin, thank you so much for your time again. Always good to talk to you. It's been a few weeks since we spoke last, and it is now August. So let's just get a recap of what we saw for the month of July. Was it normal? Was it not normal? It felt like it was really wet.
Yep. So great to be back with you, David, as always. And if you have an hour, we can talk about all the things that happened in July, but we'll try to make it brief here. So yes, a remarkably wet July. If you look at 153 years of statewide records, second wettest on record preliminarily. Now we're still doing the quality second wettest on record, only behind the great flood year of 1993. So we're still working on the quality control on our National Weather Service co-op stations and CoCoRa's rain gauges across the state, but it's looking pretty solid that it'll be around slightly above 9 inches of rainfall. And normally the 30-year average for July is 4.17 inches. So if you look at the last 10 years, in fact, in terms of trends, we've seen a trend downward in rainfall in July, anywhere from 5 to 10%. So the 30,000 foot view here is that it was a really, really wet July for us.
Now, from a urban person, someone who lives in the suburbs, that just meant you have to mow your lawn a lot more. But for the folks out in urban America, I felt like you had a comment on that. What were you about to say there?
That has been the number one comment that I've gotten from people is that I've never cut my lawn this much in July. And you think, go back 5 years, we were in a 2020 through 2024 drought, and it basically peaks during the warmest time of the year. Grass goes dormant, you're not cutting it. This year, it was the reverse of that. You cut it more often than you have over the last 5 years.
So farmers have to cut their own lawns as well, and sometimes they're a lot bigger than your average lawn as well. So that's got to be pretty annoying for them just as much as it is for us, if not more so. But there's a lot more land that farmers will be dealing with as well. What did all that rain mean for our soil moisture levels, for compaction? I mean, there's not much tractors moving in the fields right now because of all the crops there, but what did you hear from?
So we get a lot of, any kind of extreme event that you get, we always want to compare it to the last basically extreme event that is of a similar nature. So people were thinking back to 1993, the great flood year, as I mentioned earlier. This was way different than 93 in that soil moisture profiles were at capacity, aquifers were at capacity, stream flows were well above average. We had a lot of snow in the winter of 92 to 93, a lot of that melting into the soil profiles, but also runoff. You're raising all those hydrological indicators, and then you get into an extremely wet stretch through the growing season, and you see the record flooding in 1993. We're in a little different, in fact, a much different situation this go around. We were coming into the growing season a little drier. Soil profiles were below capacity, so there was plenty of infiltration capacity as we moved into the wettest months of the year, May, June. May wasn't extremely wet, but June we did, towards the end of the month, turn the faucet on. And then again, the wetness that we saw in July. We had capacity in the soil profiles for infiltration. Our stream flows were trending lower. Now they are above average, of course, with all the runoff that we've seen and saturated profiles in terms of soil moisture. But we had capacity to uptake that water, and hence you don't see that widespread and significant flooding that we saw back in 1993. So two different beasts, but you always get those questions on, is this looking like 1993? No.
It is not 1993. And I think another thing about 93 versus now would be the intensity of rainfall. And it feels like ours was just every 2 or 3 days, we just got some. Now occasionally there was a squall and it'd be really hard, but it wasn't like 5 inches hard. It was, a couple inches in a matter of, I don't know, 15, 30 minutes.
Yes, and I've always had a sneaking suspicion that you're an amateur meteorologist because you summed it up very well. We had several rainfalls. You look at consecutive days of rainfall, or you look at days in which we had rainfall in the month of July. You had many stations across the state that had rainfall on at least half the days of the month, if not more.
Wow.
Just in my gauge in Des Moines, I had 5 rainfall events over 1 inch over 24 hours. You don't see that typically. A National Weather Service co-op station or a CoCoRaHS gauge would typically see an inch or more over 24 hours once or twice a year. I had 5 in July. So that gets to your point that these weren't these 4 and 5 inch rainfall events that we saw back in 1993 through the teeth of the flooding, but we were seeing smaller scale rainfalls much more often through July, and that stacks up to where we are now.
What was the cause of all this? What were the movements that you were watching that seemed to make this all happen the way it did?
Yeah, so a lot of factors came into play. The Gulf moisture gate was wide open. If you look at wind flow, wind barbs from our national weather or from our airports where we have automated weather stations that take wind observations, the dominant wind direction was out of the south for much of the month. So you're pumping in that Gulf moisture. You also have Pacific monsoonal moisture that's making its way to the upper Midwest in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. And then third, you add through pollination and tasseling, or getting into July, peak evapotranspiration from corn and beans, what we call the corn sweats. More should be called corn breath, but we won't get into the semantics here. But when you're talking about dew point temperatures, we were in the 70s and lower 80s for a stretch of time during the heat dome in the 3rd week of July. So you had ample moisture for thunderstorms to work off of. All you needed was an impulse to come through the state and you would fire off thunderstorms. But with the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, meteorological forcing was able to efficiently make rainfall events on several days in the month. And that's where you get these above average rainfall totals. So you had multiple moisture sources coming into play and you had the right atmospheric conditions. Now, of course, besides the derecho, and we've had a few tornadoes and some severe weather in July, the ingredients for severe weather outbreaks didn't come together. So we had the thunderstorms we needed, but we didn't get a lot of severe weather out of it. And of course, if you look at the drought monitor depiction that was released last Thursday, only less than 1% of D1 moderate drought down in southwest Iowa, a little pocket of D0 around Ottumwa. But if you're drawing up a rapid drought buster, now we weren't in exceedingly bad drought, but we had drought conditions across the state. Late July or late June into July is exactly what you want to bust a drought.
Hey, Justin, hold that thought for just a moment. We're going to get back to you, but first we're going to take a look at the marketplace. And it was a mixed close at the end of Monday's trading session. September corn down 2.5 cents, $3.87, with December falling 3 3/4, $4.07. Soybeans in September 5 3/4 cents higher, $9.75 1/4, with November rising 5 1/4, $9.94 1/2. Soybean meal in September $6.10 a ton in the green, $277. September wheat unchanged, $5.16 3/4, with December also unchanged, $5.37. In the livestock market close for Monday, August live cattle up 77 cents a hundredweight, $230.90. October rising 42 cents at $224.10. Feeder cattle in August 82 cents higher at $335.40, with September rising 52 cents at $334.45. Lean hogs in August 82 cents a hundredweight higher, $108.17, with October rising 85 cents at $90.90 a hundredweight. That is the Monday market close. This is Farm Here Daily. mentioned that there wasn't as much severe weather as might be expected with this. I would like to make a quick mention of that derecho we saw.
Yes.
How isolated was that? How expansive was that?
So you look at the heat dome that developed that gave us those oppressive temperatures in the third week of July. That derecho was a function of that heat dome breaking down. We call it ridge riders. You get disturbances that ride along the interface with the warm and moist air in the air mass that was covering Iowa. And there's a temperature gradient between the cooler and drier air north of us. And when those two things come together and you have unidirectional wind shear through the environment, or a direction or wind shear going one way through the depth of the atmosphere, it's a perfect squall line printer. Printer meaning that we saw several disturbances moving across the upper Midwest that were squall lines. To become a derecho, it has to meet a set of criteria. The first being the disturbance has to go at least 400 miles. Secondly, it has to be at least 60 miles wide. Thirdly, within that swath, you have to have a majority of the wind gust at 58 miles per hour, and then several well-placed 75 mile per hour gusts within that swath. So when a squall line or a bow echo meets those criteria, the Storm Prediction Center classifies it as a derecho. Now, in terms of its extent, again, we talk about analogs or previous events. Everybody remembers the August 10th, 2020 derecho, $13 billion worth of damage across much of Iowa, across the upper Midwest, but a lot of that was in Iowa. 3 million acres of corn and beans destroyed. This was not anywhere near that 1 percentile event. But if you're in the path of that, if you have an operation or if you have a farm that's in the path of wind speeds and wind gusts in the 92 to 99 mile per hour range, you're going to see impacts. We had 2 tornadoes also in Lyon County. Overall, it looked like it's the northern 2 tier of counties. And then about north central Iowa, it took a nosedive towards Cedar Rapids and Waterloo. We also see wind gusts there. So the path length and the path width was a lot more narrow than the August 10th, 2020 event, but still very impactful if you were in the way of it.
Right. I was indeed actually in the way of that one. It blew off part of my roof. So,
Oh, wow.
I experienced that firsthand. I remember getting a text from my family members in Des Moines. I was in Cedar Rapids at the time, and I got a text, and my mom was like, "Hey, make sure to put all your trash cans in the garage because we just had a crazy thing come through." And then it was very, very bad in Cedar Rapids. I even remember seeing like some second floors just totally torn off. But I remember when all this happened, when the derecho showed up, that was kind of discussed as, oh, this is a once in a 50-year event. Were they saying at the time that term derecho was once in a 50-year event, or that type of derecho was a once in a 50-year event? Because it feels like we've had a derecho just about every year since.
You're right. So I kind of squeezed in a little statistic there. We like to think about, these 100, 500-year flood. We don't think of things that way anymore. We talk about exceedance probabilities. So the potential for an event to happen, for example, the August 10th, 2020 derecho was a 1 percentile event. So you wouldn't expect that. The annual exceedance for a storm of that magnitude is less than 0.01%. So very small. They can happen every year. But the probability of those events happening is very small versus people were talking about the flood of 1993 as a 500-year event. We wouldn't see an event like that for another 500 years. Not true. The probability is small, but we can see a type of event like that every year. It just depends on if all the things come together. So when you think of the climatology of derechos, we expect one once every 2 years. If you take the period of record, basically going back to the 1950s. Now, prior to the August 10th event, you'd have to go back to 2013 for a derecho to hit Iowa. Since August 10th, 2020, we've had 6 or 7 derechos. So it seems that there's ebb and flow of these events happening. Are we going to expect more in the future? We don't necessarily know right now. We need more data points to point us in a direction if the trend is showing us that we're going to see more of these straight-lined wind events that classify as a derecho. But overall, what we can say is that the environment for severe weather is increasing in the climate projections. So we should have the expectation moving forward, particularly in that April, May, June timeframe, of more hail and high wind events over the next several decades. Tornadically, we've seen a shift in tornado activity further south and east in that Dixie Alley corridor, and think of Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, even Arkansas, southern Illinois, and a shift away from the classic tornado alley. And this has to do probably with some jet stream mechanics that I won't get into, but we definitely are seeing more straight line wind and hail events as the atmosphere warms, as you have more water vapor availability and increase the amount of instability available.
And just because I sometimes need things to be put as simply as possible for my brain, what I'm getting from you there is essentially if we had a derecho every year for the next 20 years, then one may then look at the last 200 years of Iowa history and go, okay, now it's a 2% chance, or now it'd be in the 2 percentile, but it requires that consistency of derechos or whatever percentile you're attributing over a significant amount of time in order to then attribute that lower number or higher number to it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. If you put, let's say, for example, if we have a derecho every year for the next 30 years, that will have the trend that we've had now, one derecho every 2 years. So you need to stack up data points and then compare those to the 30-year climatology to give you an idea of how often an event happens. And that's the reason why people like me exist.
Gosh, I could probably have a whole conversation with you on why it's important to look at weather as a century level phenomena as opposed to a decade span. And that would be a really interesting thing to get into. But I wanted to scoot to a different topic, and it's because you mentioned it earlier, and you hear it now from a lot of meteorologists on TV. I think did you call it the corn sweat phenomena?
Yes.
That's a really funny way to put it. And I had asked an agronomist, I was like, oh, what do you think about like the corn attributing more humidity to our state? And they said, there's probably some of that, but it's probably all the rain too. So what's that balance? What do you see there?
So you think about orders of magnitude of an event. So mentioned the Gulf moisture gate was wide open, contributing billions and billions of gallons of water vapor in the moist flow that we get off the Gulf. Combine that with the Pacific moisture, you're getting dew points in the upper 70s and low 80s. Now we're talking about evapotranspiration. So through the photosynthetic process, any vegetation pulls in carbon dioxide and then breathes out water vapor and oxygen. So it just so happens we have 13 million acres of corn planted here in Iowa, and per acre, per day, about 4,000 gallons are contributed to the atmosphere. So if we're talking about how much we're contributing to the dew point, or the amount of moisture in the air, which gives us the relative humidity when you compare it to temperature, you're probably getting 2, 3, potentially 4 degrees on that dew point, but it's a local contribution. A majority of the water vapor that we have for thunderstorms to feed off of in the upper Midwest comes from the Gulf and this monsoonal moisture from the Pacific.
As we look forward towards, I appreciate that explanation, by the way. As we look forward to the next couple of weeks till we talk next, I just want to get a gauge as we're nearing the end of summer. We still have a decent way to go, but we're nearing the end. What are you looking at in terms of the telekinetic patterns going on globally? And also, what are your expectations as we wrap up harvest?
Yep. Great set of questions, as always. So you look at the teleconnections, we think of the dominant climate driver being El Nino or La Nina. As we've discussed in our previous episodes, we're in ENSO neutral or right in between. So the equatorial Pacific, where we monitor sea surface temperatures, they're near normal. So nothing for the atmosphere to respond to. The atmosphere is decoupled or not responding to the oceanic behavior. In El Nino years, we have warmer oceanic waters. The atmosphere likes those warmer waters because it contributes more water vapor and you can fire more thunderstorms. Depending on where that warm water sets up, if it's in the Eastern Pacific or the Western Pacific, that impacts the jet stream over the United States, that teleconnection you talk about. Well, if we look at summertime behavior, very low correlation between the Pacific weather patterns, whether El Nino, La Nina, or ENSO neutral. But as we move into fall and get into winter, that's where we see the teleconnections have a higher correlation because of larger scale meteorological behavior, those highs and lows that move across the United States that bring us widespread weather. It's looking about 50-50 as we speak, whether it's going to be an ENSO neutral continuing through winter or La Nina. If it's a La Nina, then we do have analog years in which we can go back and say, when we transition from ENSO neutral from fall into winter in these previous years, going back to 1950 or going back to 1990, which is a smaller climatological time slice, what did we see precipitation-wise? What did we see temperature-wise? And then we can model that behavior in the longer-term forecast and climate models. And then that's where we get those outlooks for winter and for the next growing season. So to be determined on what behavior we're going to experience as we move into fall, but it becomes much more pertinent as we get into wintertime. And that's where we are really looking forward to whether La Nina does reform. We have a higher percentage chance of multiple La Ninas versus La Ninas going to El Nino, for example. And that's another episode there. We also have other larger scale climate patterns in the Pacific, Madden-Julian oscillation, the Pacific decadal oscillation. And then when we get into wintertime, thinking of those Arctic air outbreaks, we have an Arctic oscillation that works on a time period of several weeks. So we have to factor all these into the climate modeling. But when we do have a handle on what phase we're in of each of these oscillations or weather patterns, then that's what you get from these Climate Prediction Center outlooks monthly and seasonally. As we sit right now, fall is looking like it's going to lean towards the warm and dry side. And given all this rainfall that we've had in summertime, we could use a dry down. We could dry down the crop in the field, use less propane, for example, and get a bumper crop out of the fields if we do see those signatures of a warm and dry fall time.
Warm and dry would be great for harvest. Thanks for that note. Dr. Justin Glisan is the Iowa State Climatologist. Really grateful for having you on Farm Here Daily, Justin. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, David. Always a pleasure.
This is Farm Here Daily. Thank you so much for listening. And if you'd like to join our community, make sure to follow and like the program and check out our social media at Field Forward Pod. You'd also find me on social media at Geiger Reports, as well as WHO TV Channel 13 every weekday in their morning and noon hour programs. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.